that there is in fact no conflict between India and China or India and Pakistan. There is no conflict. We need to sort these things out and not get sucked into the US plans to try to get China to surrender its development. That is Chinese development is not a threat to India. So we should have nothing to do with justice for Kashmir or justice for the 26 people killed in Pahalgam in cold blood by terrorists. I mean, nothing. This was two high-powered militaries telling each other either we can destroy you or the other saying, no, we can defend ourselves. I don't agree with Professor Mearsheimer at all. I mean, I understand your position and I agree with it. But I was interested in particular in the meeting that Mr. Trump had with the president or whatever, the acting president of Syria, formerly known as Mr. al-Jolani, because
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount in the link given in the description box. But the least you can do is to like, share, comment, and watch this show. Without further ado, let me welcome Vijay Prashad. Vijay is an Indian historian and author of several books and a political commentator. He is the executive director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and the chief editor of Leftward Books. Vijay, welcome back to India and Global Left.
It's a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
I want to start with in India, Pakistan. We did a full show with Dr. Taimur Rahman, so I don't want to get into all the background and details of what happened and what are the root causes of it. But I think what I want to ask you is that as India and Pakistan, as the two military de-escalates, there doesn't seem to be a de-escalation in the public sphere, led by social media and television media, which are effectively hooked into each other. There seems to be an enormous continuation of escalation or even further escalation, which I feel is very dangerous because it keeps the potential alive of a war, because next time anything happens, and we know that the line of control is so fragile, is violation of ceasefire is not unusual, or God forbid a terror attack, it pushes states into further escalation or a war. What is your thoughts about this reproduction of war hysteria in the public sphere?
Partly you haven't had a war in world history where the public hasn't been riled up, but now it's a little different because there's a greater opportunity for rumor and for belligerence to spread. I mean, the amount of fake videos and things that circulated, not only in WhatsApps and in social media, but also on mainstream channels, it got so bad that they had to apologize. I mean, they had to say that they used fake things. I mean, there were things that circulated, pictures from Gaza and so on. Look, in 1992, I think, I wrote one of my stories. I was writing for the Pioneer of all papers. And one of the stories I did was how BBC reporting on Kashmir used images from the West Bank in Palestine. And I showed and they put a big picture in the Pioneer of the tank. It was an Israeli tank and Palestinians. And they said, this is Kashmir. This use of fake videos and so on is not new. It's an old thing. But this time it was at a different level. I mean, people were saying things like, there's been an attack in Karachi port, and in Pakistan, people were circulating videos saying we've disabled everything. And, this came from somewhere. I mean, this doesn't come from ordinary people. This is a, troll sort of situation. I don't know where this came from. Did it come from the BJP troll armies putting out stuff? I don't know. Somebody needs to study it. But I will say that it is very interesting how the escalation happened, because I think the Indian Air Force, remember the Indian Navy and the Army on both sides, actually, the Navy and Army didn't move. This was an Air Force engagement. Maybe some Army was involved in the surface to air and surface to surface missiles. Some Army may have been involved also in the drone things, but it was largely Air Force. And on the first night, when the Indian Air Force crossed over, it was very interesting. Um, you know, you say, okay, it's about disabling the terrorist camps. Yeah, that was the media narrative. In fact, the army was testing whether it could destroy, or the Air Force was testing whether it could destroy Pakistan's air defense systems. And it turned out, and by the way, no Indian plane crossed the border and no Pakistani plane crossed the border. They were firing from each sides of the border. But on the first night, it becomes very clear when you look at most of the open source evidence that in fact Indian Air Force was not able to destroy the systems of air defense. And so then you went to the drones, and then both sides basically sought a de-escalation because they just were testing each other. This had nothing to do with justice for Pahalgam, by the way. That was not happening. That air thing was not justice for Pahalgam. That was, they were testing each other. This is the first super high tech air war in world history, where two sides, because in Palestine, there is no two sides. Very few militaries in the world have two sides with, the highest tech stuff. India with the Rafale fighters, the Chinese fighters in the Pakistani side, Israeli drones, Turkish drones, Russian drones. I mean, loitering munitions from, I think, Russia. All kinds of weapons in the air were in play. But this had nothing to do with justice for Kashmir or justice for the 26 people killed in Pahalgam in cold blood by terrorists. I mean, nothing. This was two high-powered militaries telling each other either we can destroy you, or the other saying, no, we can defend ourselves. I mean, it's a vulgar display of high-tech weaponry. Nothing to do with the people of Pahalgam. Just let's be pretty clear. And I don't think they've found the people who did organize the attack. None of that. I mean, it's not clear. There's no media report, no government report saying, why did this happen? Where was the security at the camp? Who were these people? Who were they attached to? Where were they trained? Do you have any information? There's nothing. There's no government white paper. There's nothing. It's just this air war. And then they said, well, we sort of punished Pakistan. Sorry, this is entirely a public relations campaign, which, I don't think either side were interested in escalation beyond this air war. No military crossed the border. Okay. So there was no, in that sense, need for a like a cessation of hostilities where there was a problem of who's going to withdraw from where. There was nothing like that. They wanted a way out after they tested each other. And I think both sides used the Americans to come in and say, we've done a deal. And that was that. I mean, and the people of Pahalgam who died there, I don't think their souls or, wherever they are will find peace in the fact that the people who killed them have not been, brought to justice at all. At all.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you said that in many ways there was no need of um, demobilization because, as you said, that armies didn't cross each other's territory. There was no drafting or additional military mobilized or any of that sort. So it was effectively an easy de-escalation. But I do think, though, as I said, that there is a much greater need to demobilize in terms of the public opinion. And also, it raises questions about journalism itself. I mean, NDTV used to be it was not a left media anyway, but it had some credibility. And then in the middle of this, they said that whatever we are reporting is 50% right and 50% wrong. I mean, you can't say that. You can't say that we are just reporting and 50% is right and 50% is wrong. And that's the TV media, and even the most respected newspapers like The Hindu, I was tracking it rigorously. What it
Yeah.
did was it effectively gave up journalism beyond a point. I mean, initially it reported that three aircrafts were shot down, and it was told by an internal government sources. It was brought down immediately. Most likely, they have gotten a phone call from the Indian government. But from then on, what it was doing is it was basically quoting government sources. It stopped reporting what the Pakistani media is reporting. It also stopped reporting what the international media, Reuters and others were covering the situation, was reporting, let alone it sending its own journalists to the ground. So I think it does raise a question of journalism, particularly in the age of war, when media does come under vicious pressure and it just buckles.
Well, look at what we are saying. Okay, let's go back to Kargil, 1999. NDTV sent Barkha Dutt to Kargil. She stood next to a Bofors gun and kept saying, "We are winning. We are doing this. We are doing that." She reported in that way. By the way, during this conflict, she was on Piers Morgan's show, and on that show, I don't know if you watched the episode.
I
Basically,
did.
she sounded like a government spokesperson. That's what she sounded like. So, I mean, there is a through line. I know that NDTV's changed ownership and so on, but there's a through line from Kargil to this. I'm not making any basic judgment about the channel, but something happens to journalism in a time of war, and journalists and owners of companies become, I mean, that's where we get the word yellow journalism. It comes from war, when a newspaper in the United States basically fabricated a conflict so that Teddy Roosevelt could go to Cuba with the Rough Riders. I mean, that's his newspaper fabricated a conflict. It's called yellow journalism. That's exactly what was happening. It's pitiful, but your question is impossible because the middle class in India, when people said, "Oh, the national mood," okay, people use this term a lot. You're against the national mood. I got messages saying you are against the national mood. I mean, how do you know what the national mood is? The national mood is two mirrors. One mirror is called the capitalist press, which includes the paper and the TV channel you mentioned. The other mirror is the middle class, the 50 million odd people who watch the English, channels, and maybe, 100 odd million more of the middle class that watch the Hindi and other channels. South India was, I'm told, completely different. This media and this money media and this middle class mirror each other, and they reflect each other. So this media speaks to that middle class, and they call this the national mood. There are a billion people, okay, peasants, delivery drivers, and so on. We don't know what their mood is. Do they even know the conflict is happening? Somebody who's working in the fields in Hyderabad, I mean, in Andhra Pradesh, are they involved in this? Do they have an opinion? I mean, nobody went out there. I didn't see any good reporting of people going out there and talking to bus drivers and saying, "Well, what's your feeling about this?" They put mics in people's face and say things like, "Do you stand with India? आप इंडिया के साथ है या नहीं?" One little kid, said something like, "This is ridiculous. We don't want a war," and so on. And he was pilloried. That clip went all over the place, pilloried, because generally the mic was put, "आप India के साथ है या नहीं?" And obviously the answer has got to be, "हाँ, मैं India के साथ हूँ." And so then they say, "That's the national mood." That's you shoving the mic in somebody's face. If you shove a mic in my face and you ask me, "Are you with India?" What am I supposed to say? Am I going to say, "No, I'm not with India"? It's a ridiculous question. Yeah. So the mood was generated by these two mirrors reflecting each other. Now, you asked, how do you de escalate the mood? This is very difficult. You and I don't have the kind of reach in either the airwaves, broadcast media, or in social media. We just don't have that reach to become a mirror, where we create. And the people on this side of the mirror of your program are a tiny minority compared to what's there. How do you de-escalate the mood? You don't. That's the problem. One of the problems is that the political leadership is so poor, that the political leadership didn't come out there. Nobody came out there and said, "Look, neither the people of Pakistan nor the people of India want a conflict. Okay, this is two governments seeking legitimacy. The BJP is thinking of the Bihar elections, and the Pakistani government is thinking of the fact that Imran Khan in jail is more popular than them. So they seek legitimacy through war. This is the age-old issue. Where was the sober politician who came out there and made that strong speech and then got enough TV coverage, which is also difficult to get, for that speech? I mean, Shashi Tharoor, Congress opposition MP, sounded also like a spokesperson for the BJP. I thought his interview was absolutely ludicrous, and the videos he made were embarrassing. Jai Hind and so on, embarrassing. I've known this man for a very long time. What does he want? Does move to the BJP? Might as well. Yeah. I mean, you are in the Congress opposition. You should have asked some questions. Primary question is, you've basically annulled the politics of Jammu and Kashmir. You said we'll make it safer. Is it safer? This terrible attack has happened under your watch. You are responsible. Yeah, where's the intelligence? Yeah, didn't you have any intelligence about this? It's ridiculous. Nobody asked those questions. Yeah, if you're a sober journalist, so de-escalate the mood. You're joking. There is no credible voice there that's out there asking a question about whether this is the mood. They are also, if there's the media and the middle class, there's a third mirror, Shashi Tharoor.
Yeah, well, we do know that particularly in the bordering areas, especially in Kashmir, the mood was absolutely anti-war. Reuters did go in and cover a lot of migrant workers there in particular, but also those who were displaced and they were relocated from the borders into the camps in Srinagar and so on. And they do tell us in great detail how disturbing it was to hear the sound of the jets flying all over their heads in the night and so on. So that much we know. Of course, you're right. We don't have a larger sense of what the rest of the India thought about it, and a lot of them didn't know anything. Perhaps that's my guess. I think my final question in this segment is. You raised an important question. It's not just the media. It was also about the political parties and whether they were forget about being able to, but whether they were ready to even raise the right questions. And when it comes to internal politics, even when the parties failed, whether it was the reading down of Article 370 or from time to time anti-Muslim bills and laws, there were many political parties who would come out and say that, no, it's wrong, we stand against it. But this time, it is clear that the political parties failed in that. And I want to ask you particularly how you read the mainstream communist parties there, because, and you would know more than me, I didn't follow it very closely, but I did see some official statements. Some were very sober, sane, of course, but there were no clear, downright anti-war position from even the communist parties. I'm very curious what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated situation because I think there's been a debate inside the communist left. I mean, just a few days after the ceasefire, there was a huge demonstration led by the communist parties in Calcutta. They marched, I think, down Charangi or somewhere. It's a very large demonstration against war, against jingoism, against, the attacks at Muslims in the country and whatnot. I thought that was a powerful demonstration. I think the Kisan Sabha statement was very strong anti-war statement. I think, the party statements were what they were. I mean, people have read them. I would have liked a much stronger clearer statement saying that, look, firstly, the war you're going to prosecute is not about justice for Pahalgam. Let's just separate these things, because what happened in Pahalgam was a terrible terrorist attack. Yeah, totally condemn it. Everybody condemned. Of course, it was condemned. How can you not condemn something where people are with gunpoint asked, "What's your religion?" It's like a Sadat Hasan Manto story. I don't know if you know the story Mistake. I mean, Manto writes these stories about during the partition, people who asked, lift up your lungi, show me if you're circumcised. No, bang. That sort of thing. Horrible, ghastly. But a left party should ask, how do we know who conducted this? If we don't have intelligence that it's going to happen, how do you have intelligence about who they were? How are you so sure? Like we want to find out who did it in order to prevent it happening again. Attacking Pakistan as an entity doesn't do anything, particularly given the fact that the Pakistani defense minister goes on Yalda Hakim's show on Sky News and says, we used to do the dirty work of the Americans, we used to harbor these camps. Now we don't want to do that anymore. That was before the seventh night. Yeah. There could have been an opening like, okay, let's talk about these camps. Why pretend that the airstrike was going to take care of it? You don't even tell us who these people were. Like, how do you know who they were? So the left should have taken that position, in a sense, divided the event and punishment for those who did the event with an attack at a country called Pakistan. That's the US war on terror mentality. Those who harbor terrorists are also terrorists. I mean, there were people on television in India saying Pakistan is a terrorist state. What that means is that Pakistan no longer follows the Westphalian laws. Now, that's an enormous concept because that means that why would India allow the IMF to provide a loan if it's a terrorist state? Why didn't India block the loan to Pakistan? If it's a terrorist state, why does India, sit at the table with Pakistan at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? You can't do that. Like it's not a terrorist state. Okay, it's definitely not. It follows the Westphalian laws. It's a legitimate country. It's a legitimate state. That's a very irresponsible way to consider power. But it's the US war on terror mentality. Remember, George W. Bush said, either you're with us, you're against us. And if you harbor terrorists, you're a terrorist. Yeah, from that logic, they said, say, Cuba is a terrorist state. That was the logic. Yeah. Or Afghanistan is a terrorist state. That's a logic. So India followed that logic, and the left should have said, this is absolutely out of order. We have had a terrible terrorist incident in Pahalgam. We need to have justice for those who are killed. That means we need to find out who's doing these things and prosecute them and work with the Pakistanis if the defense minister makes that kind of comment. But the left didn't do that. I think what happens is when the so-called national mood drowns you, it becomes very hard to speak because you are underwater in a way. And you start saying things that are not very clear and are very confusing for people. But I take strong refuge in the Kisan Sabha statement, which I thought was terrific, and in the fact that there are lots of protests going on now, led by the left against the jingoism. So I think that the statements itself were weak, should have been stronger. I'm saying it directly to you. Yeah, they should have been much stronger. They should have distinguished the justice for the dead with this war on terror mentality vis-a-vis Pakistan.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's the reason why I didn't use the word left. I used communist parties because I my question was on them, because I was also aware that the Kisan Sabha, for our international viewers, we are talking about the farmers constellation of organizations and unions. They definitely came out and had a much clearer and anti-war statement.
And that's the Communist Farmers Union.
That's true.
So that's important to mention. I mean, it's the Communist Farmers Union that has also signed on to BDS against Israel.
I want to discuss a little bit about the prospect of a new Cold War in the Indian subcontinent to begin with, and then we can go into East Asia and so on. But I want to stick to the subcontinent, given so much of the post-escalation talks and rhetorics are about Chinese, as you said, like Chinese technology versus the Western technology, or China versus I don't know. I mean, India didn't have a side to that extent. The Americans didn't come to India's help or whatever. It's something I'm curious to ask you, because the subcontinent was indirectly a part of the first Cold War. It was not directly a part in the sense it was not Korea or Vietnam or Afghanistan. I mean, there were some angles to it during the Bangladesh Liberation War, but it was remotely. It was not a direct part of that. Of course, Pakistan was a direct part of it because of the Afghanistan angle. Mm, I think there is a fluid situation emerging now, given India has refused to
Mhm.
normalize its relationship with China. China sees it all the more important to also, given India uses its anti-China rhetoric to participate in these AUKUS and Quads and whatnot, which is led by Western imperialist forces. China also sees a need to solidify its relationship with Pakistan in a way that is against India's interest. And this might brew into a massive new Cold War, as we know that the relationship between China and the United States would go downhill and downhill from there on, given the US is hell bent on containing China, which we will come to in our next question. I wonder what your thoughts are about this brewing war, the new Cold War in the subcontinent, because there has been a tradition of non aligned movement about which you have been writing about.
I mean, look, the subcontinent is divided and has been divided for a very long time. I mean, it's very unfortunate that because of the internal divides between India and Pakistan, there's the divides we've already sort of hinted at. There's the question of Kashmir and so on. Between India and Nepal, there's disagreements over Kala Pani, and India occasionally just shuts the borders and tries to starve Nepal to agree. I mean, very brutal big brother kind of tactics between India and Bangladesh. There's a problem of water again, I mean, the fact that India suspended the Indus Waters Treaty from 1960 is horrendous. I mean, that treaty survived three previous wars, 65, 71, and 99. There was no need to suspend it. I mean, it's a perfectly good neighborly treaty. It's international treaty, but it's crazy. Our internal problems are such that we cannot take advantage of regional trade. Our regional trade with each other is minimal. I mean, in the 90s, there was this terrific idea, the peace pipeline from the South Fars field in Iran to draw natural gas to India through Pakistan. Pakistan makes money with the fees, and India gets low cost natural gas without having gas, say, as in liquefied form. At the time, Enron Corporation came and, in Maharashtra, it built a big, giant fake factory in a way for liquefied natural gas, but you would have just had it unliquefied and cheaper from Iran. Well, that would have been amazing, yeah. But it would require agreements between India, Pakistan, and so on. Didn't happen. India has actually lost out on complementarities. Meanwhile, China, big country, has actually taken advantage of its neighborhood. It has very close economic ties with Cambodia, with Laos, with Vietnam, with Japan, with South Korea, with, of course, North Korea. Very good ties with the rest of Southeast Asia, with Burma, Thailand, whatever. I mean, it has really taken advantage of its region. And it has benefited those countries and China. Laos benefits. Vietnam has one of the highest growth rates in the world. That actually is primarily because of its link to the Chinese economy. If India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, I mean, the complementarities are enormous. If Indian companies took advantage of the kind of things that are there in Nepal, for instance, in the higher altitudes, you can make all kinds of things you can't make in India that you used to make in Kashmir. You remember we had watchmaking factories. HMT used to make watches in Kashmir. I had that HMT watch in the 1980s, yeah, made in Kashmir. You could make those in Nepal. There's a complementarities are there, the Nepalis, if they had actually open access to Indian borders, would benefit. So India and the neighborhood getting drawn further into a new Cold War, it's not like it's going to get any different for India. It's just going to get worse. Like, what do I mean? Firstly, it would just tighten the conflict between India and Pakistan, number one, which is just unnecessary. I mean, India and Pakistan need to have a modus vivendi, which is going to end up being a peace agreement. It's just got to happen. I mean, when Imran Khan was the prime minister, he opened the Kartarpur corridor to allow Sikhs to go to Kartarpur Sahib. It's very important for my family because my great grandfather was the Guru Sahib at Kartarpur. He was the guy who maintained the Gurdwara and the place of pilgrimage. And so that corridor, because Kartarpur is in Pakistan, was very important for Sikhs. And Imran Khan just opened a gate for people to come in. Those kind of things are important. They're emotional. We need to lift them up and remember them. When Indians were allowed to go and watch a cricket match at Gaddafi Stadium, very important. Change the lives of many people. We need more people-to-people contact. We just don't have enough of that. Yeah, and then trade. I mean, the advantages would be incredible. As I said, the natural gas from Iran, and so to get sucked further into a conflict between the US and China is going to harden the borders, harden the conflict in South Asia. And plus, nobody in India, I think, would like to have a actual hot war with the Chinese. Nobody. I mean, the Chinese military now is at a different level than it was even in 1962. I mean, I know we produce Akash missiles and so on made by the Tata company. I know all that Larsen and Toubro, they've been making weapon systems now from cigarettes to weapons and whatnot. But the problem is that you'll be outclassed by the Chinese, and then will the US come to your aid? What will they do? Will they want to have an engagement with China? I mean, it's off the table. India and China, firstly, just last year, agreed to increase the number of visas. In fact, India raised the visa limit. China had already got they were giving higher number of visas. This is important. I mean, we don't have actually any issues with the Chinese, if you think about it. What are the issues? The minor border dispute in the Northeast can be solved. The dispute up there in Aksai Chain is moot. There is no dispute. I mean, basically, most of Aksai Chain, which is uninhabited, is used by the Chinese as a road to link Xinjiang to Tibet. Forget it. That's gone. You're fighting over rocks, as Nehru said. In Northeast, it's a tense issue because Tawang and all of that, these are populated areas. But, it's not like the Chinese are not reasonable people. They cut a deal with the Russians about 5 or 6 years ago to sort out their border dispute. These are old colonial borders. What's the problem? Are we still fantasizing that India is going to lead the charge to free Tibet? It's not going to happen. Yeah. These things aren't going to happen. So at one level, you think, what's the problem between India and China? If I asked you, can you list the three disputes between India and China? There are no disputes. That, as I said, the border in Arunachal is not a dispute. It's a matter of reconciliation. They need to just sit down. There's nothing to dispute over. Yeah, they have a problem with where the line is. They just need to figure that out. Two reasonable countries, huge countries. What are you talking about? The enormous economic advantages for India from China it's like unbelievable. If we trade properly with each other, it would help Nepal and so on. So I think that sensible people should be saying that there is in fact no conflict between India and China or India and Pakistan. There is no conflict. We need to sort these things out and not get sucked into the US plans to try to get China to surrender its development. Chinese development is not a threat to India. So we should not get into a war to prevent China from developing. That is precisely what is driving the United States, and it's got nothing to do with India.
Just to put in context the trade thing, if you look at the ASEAN trade as a whole, roughly 1/5 to 1/4, like 20 to 25% of that trade is traded regionally among the ASEAN nations. Just compare that with the South Asian, I mean, maybe zero. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit by saying zero, but it's close to that. I think this is a good segue to go into this larger US-led narrative of containing China. We had Professor John Mearsheimer, and we got into a big debate. And effectively, the terms of the debate was that we said that the differences between the Asian countries, you have given us a great sense of India and China, but we can talk about Japan and China, and one can go on and on. But we said that these are differences that can be roughly classified as border disputes, and sometimes there are some territorial disputes in the islands and so on. Um, One can at best go that some of them had some strategic component, but they are anyway regional in nature. But the presence of the United States converts these differences into a larger strategic conflict, which becomes so much volatile. That was our position. Professor Mearsheimer said that that's not true. These neighbors are just incapable of resolving things in themselves and so on. And the United States coming in is not just about winning its battle against China, but it is also providing more stability, a kind of policing order in the region. I wonder what your thoughts are. I don't know if you saw the video, but this was the terms of the debate. Just respond to that.
I mean, I don't agree with Professor Mearsheimer at all. I mean, I understand your position and I agree with it. So that's the first thing I would say. I think your position is very sober, which is that okay, let's take island disputes, or even let's take the question of Taiwan. Taiwan's largest trading partner is the mainland in China. Taiwan is not an issue of an indigenous population that is being threatened with occupation. I mean, in fact, the largest part of the population in Taiwan are people who invaded the island in 1949, running away from the communists and suppressed the indigenous people, and then had a military dictatorship for decades. So I don't feel like Taiwan is like this weak place that the Chinese want to invade a settler colonial. It's already a settler colonial island, if you use those terms, which don't really work very well in an old part of the world where everybody is settler colonial. I mean, if you were to do that, we'd have to ask most of the population of China to withdraw somewhere into Central Asia, because the Han came from outside and whatnot. We can't dial history back. We are where we are. We have to take it as it is. Yeah. Okay. So what are the border disputes that involve islands? Many of them are about the law of the sea, which is that your international boundary starts at the edge of your country. So if you can claim a set of island chains, then you can say, look, foreign militaries cannot come so many nautical miles close to us. A lot of it is about that. Some of it is about energy that's in the waters. There's fields of gas maybe and so on that countries are disputing. That happens a lot in island chains. Yeah. That, is there in some of them. But these are all resolvable. These are all resolvable. For instance, if the US Navy stops coming close to the Chinese shoreline, then China would not need to demand a greater buffer. Because the idea of so many nautical miles away from me is actually the reason why they contest and they started building some islands. Yeah. Because they want to claim you've got to go further. You can't come so close to our coastline. It's threatening to us. Yeah. No Chinese ships are off the coast of New York. One Chinese frigate circumnavigated Australia, and the whole of Australia freaked out that the Chinese are patrolling our waters. Meanwhile, Australian ships are in the South China Sea. The British ships, the Queen Elizabeth II was in the China Sea. Why? What are they patrolling? Who gives them the right to be, Mearsheimer's term, policeman? We Asians don't need a US policeman there. We are quite capable of dealing with these things. The Filipinos, if you have an American ship there, it emboldens countries not to want to solve things, small countries. They say, well, the United States is behind us. We don't have to come to an agreement. There's a dispute between Russia and Japan on the Aleutian Islands as well. Those are solvable. I don't think we need to police solvable disputes. We need to settle them. I would like to see more UN involvement in this, less US involvement. If anything, the UN should be more involved, using the Treaty of the Laws of the Seas and other treaties to try to solve some of these disputes. Okay. India and Pakistan. We don't need the US to come in as a third party. It's not necessary. Okay. It's not even about the line. Look at the border, India and Pakistan. From the Rann of Kutch all the way up, most of the border is delimited and agreed. Most of the border is delimited and agreed. We have a border all the way up through the Jammu area, right up to the edge of the Kashmir Valley, and then there's a very small section of India, Pakistan, which is the line of control. And it's a line of control because it was the 48 line, and because the Indian government claims Pakistan occupied Kashmir, and the Pakistani government Indian occupied Kashmir, that's what each other calls it. They claim these two areas, this valley area, which runs from Mirpur down to, Pahalgam or whatever, that strip is contested by two sides. This is solvable. What are the three possibilities? One, the whole of the Kashmir Valley is part of Pakistan. Okay, I doubt that the whole population of Srinagar will agree to that. Second, that the whole of the Kashmiri speaking area, all the way up to Mirpur, many of the people live in Bradford in England for Mirpur. It's basically Mirpur is Bradford. And that whole area goes to India, which I doubt that the Mirpuris would be excited about. Maybe it actually helps. Number three option is the whole thing is one country, which is a crazy idea because it'll be landlocked. Everybody will hate on it. It's going to have serious problems. Even the Kurdish PKK, which has been fighting for decades for an independent Kurdistan, has just put down its guns and said, we are going to deal within Turkey politically. Yeah, the question of Kurdistan has been, in a sense, surrendered by the PKK just this week. So why are we entering a little statelet into the top of the Hindu Kush mountains? It's not going to be a viable statelet, okay? India will be angry. Pakistan will be angry. Who's going to assist this development, the social development of the area? You could then come up with a fourth argument, which has been on the table for years, condominium status. Yeah, both sides have some sort of thing. Those rarely work. Condominiums rarely work. I mean, my feeling, frankly, is that the line of control is converted into a border and you go from there. And you have justice for the Kashmiri people who live on both sides of the border. I'm a Punjabi. Most of my family was from Lahore. We have some family still in Pakistan. The rest came to India. We have family on both sides of the border. It works, man. I mean, they are there, we are here. What can you do? Yeah, this is the tide of history. You can't do anything about it. Yeah, I mean, what are we going to do? Fight for a united Punjab? Sorry, Khalistanis tried it, didn't work. Yeah, most people in Punjab don't want that. They are quite happy being part of India. Okay, so I'm not trying to be controversial about this. I'm just raising the question. There are only a few solutions. Even whether you have a plebiscite or not, you're going to have to put one or two of these solutions on the table. There's nothing else. You can't lift out Kashmir and hang it in heaven. It's going to have to be there. Yeah. So these are the choices. What else is nothing? So when you ask the question, and you asked it very well, and when Mearsheimer said, well, these people don't know how to solve their disputes, they need policing from the United States. Well, I would say, Professor Mearsheimer, you have disputes in the Americas that you haven't solved. You want to take over Canada. You still want to overthrow the government in Cuba, in Venezuela. The United States threatening to invade Panama. I mean, you have your own problems. Deal with them. Stop sending the Navy to Asia.
I think even the difference between the third and the fourth would come down if India and Pakistan can move on. I mean, I think that your third case and the fourth case are very distinct, given the relationship between India and Pakistan is not good. But if one day the relationship is very normal, then at least at the economic level, at the cultural level, there would be like free flowing, not just goods but ideas and also people. And so to that extent, the difference is only in the matter of representation in the political bodies, right? So even that would be like very close to each other, I assume. We are also hosting Joanna Leigh, leading KMT politician from Taiwan, to speak about the One China policy and how in the early decades of the 2000s under the KMT things were moving forward, and then it was disrupted by the DPP coming to power, and how they are pushing for a hard border kind of arrangement, which puts Taiwan in massive risk because it might be the second Ukraine if they go for that. And her argument is that even if you consider 33% of the votes that DPP had, maybe like 40% of them might prefer that. That would lead to just 10% of the population in Taiwan who would like to see a separate state with a hard border, but maybe like 80 to 90% still want to be a part of that same China, of course, with different political arrangements. So I think it's fair, but we will have that show in great detail. Um, Vijay, before I ask you a very interesting last question on Marxism, I want to quickly ask you your thoughts on the Middle East. I don't want to get into individual questions because there is no time, but it's there. There seems to be some resetting of the U.S. policy in the Middle East. Or what are your thoughts on what's going on in the Middle East vis-a-vis the U.S. approach?
I mean, firstly, it's too soon to tell. Yeah, I mean, things are really in flux in South. Mr. Trump, is trying desperately to move an agenda where one point is normalization with Israel for all the Arab states. Second, business deals, which includes, the United States getting investment from the Saudi sovereign fund and so on. Saudis buying more weaponry from U.S. companies, more business as usual from the Gulf Arab states. But I was interested in particular in the meeting that Mr. Trump had with the president or whatever, the acting president of Syria, formerly known as Mr. Al-Jolani. Because, you see, one of the interesting things for Israel is that in 1979, the United States basically got the Egyptians to sign a peace agreement with Israel. That peace agreement, Camp David agreement, was very significant because basically Nasserism was totally destroyed in that moment by Anwar Sadat. And I mean, he was in a way assassinated for it. I mean, he was assassinated by the Islamic right, but he was assassinated, I think, really for Camp David.
And the
But Egypt,
Saudis didn't like it, if I remember it correctly, because they thought not enough concessions to the Palestinians were being made.
well, it's very interesting because at the time, and I think for some time later, the Saudis used to sort of hide behind the Egyptians on the Palestinian issue. So Saudi Arabia had a huge problem with Gamal Abdel Nasser because they feared that Nasserism was going to spread into, and it did, into Saudi Arabia and into the palaces, actually. There was a free princes movement inside the palaces. But they also hid behind Egypt. So as long as Egypt, and particularly Gamal Abdel Nasser, took a strong policy on Palestine, the Saudis could sit back and say, we think Palestinians should have a better deal. When Egypt capitulated to American power, it put the Saudis in a difficult position because they didn't want to go to the front of the queue to defend the Palestinians. They wanted to be behind, if Nasser is saying this, then this. Now there was no Nasser. There was a further problem then for the Palestinians when Jordan normalized in 1994 after the Oslo, or around the time of Oslo II. When Jordan capitulated, then more of the border, Egypt and then Jordan with Israel, was normal. And there was a peace agreement. And Israel in 1973 had taken, actually fully in 73, the Golan Heights. In Syria, and those were the heights with a buffer zone the UN had created on the ground. With Lebanon, Israel had invaded Lebanon in 82, then withdrew in 2000. So with Lebanon, they suppressed it by invasion. Now, it looks like Mr. Jolani is going to basically cut a peace agreement with Israel. And so almost all the border is going to be normalized. And then Lebanon, they have severely weakened Hezbollah. So the Palestinian resistance fighters are going to get very, very difficult time resupplying with weapons. They just don't have an easy border or avenue unless they smuggle it through one of the peace borders. Very hard to do. So this is going to suffocate the Palestinian armed struggle and resistance. And this is what I think is part of Trump's agenda to make the whole dazzle about business, but really it's to give Israel Palestine, to annex, whatever was there from Oslo II. So I don't know exactly what's going to come out of all this because, as I said, things are in motion. Yeah, one shouldn't be too sure about what's happening. But I will tell you that it looks to me like they are trying to force a Palestinian surrender by effectively surrounding Palestine with pro-Israel states. And the other states, Algeria, Iraq, and so on, and Iran, that maintain strong pro-Palestinian positions from the government are just unable to act. I mean, Iran and Iraq, because of the fall of the Assad government in Syria and the weakness of Hezbollah, have no way to move weapon systems to assist the liberation or resistance struggles. No way. I mean, they used to be able to just bring things to Syria and then cross the border into Lebanon and arm Hezbollah, and also help arm other places. The Palestinians in Gaza were building a lot of their own weapons, very clever. They had weapon systems under the ground, but they were also receiving weapons from friendly states. That is going to be difficult, and I think they are trying to kind of secretly enforce a surrender, which would be abysmal, But I don't know. Again, I don't want to be too sure because things are in motion, and tomorrow you don't know who's going to take out a dagger and stab who in the back.
What I get a sense from you is that in many ways it would resemble restoring the status quo of Palestine being continued to be oppressed, Iran being contained to a great extent in the region, and the economic empires of the Gulf monarchs, and then Israel, they would continue to be under the axis of the United States, which was for a moment seemed to be under crisis as the United States explored hard power to be one of the options to, use its military and bombing of Yemen and so on to think of it as a solution. But it seems to me that is essentially off the table. And what the Saudis and the Emiratis want is that they don't want the bombing to continue. They don't want a destabilized Yemen in their neighborhood. Neither do they want the Americans to attack Iran, because that would destabilize their own. But they also don't want to end the process of containing Iran and so on. So that's what is my impression. And the Americans need the Saudi investments and the trade deals now more than anything, because they are trying to move away from China. I mean, even they won't be able to move away entirely, but if they want to move away to some extent, that they do need the investments in the stock market and the bond markets from recycled from the petrodollars, and also to keep booming their military industrial complex through these trade deals. My quick final question, I've been wanting to ask you this question. This is a personal question at one level, when did Marxism influence you? And my main question is, has it changed? It must have changed over the years, because I assume you got into Marxism before the fall of the Soviet Union, before China reformed and opened up itself, turning into a mixed economy and so on. And things have moved so much. What does it mean to be a Marxist at this moment for you?
It's an excellent question, and I don't know how much time we have, because this is something we talk for hours. But
I have all the time. Decide your time. Yeah.
No. Just to put it in a nutshell, and you asked the question very well. Just to put it in a nutshell, like most people, you don't really come to Marxism by reading a book, like most people. Yeah, I came to Marxism secondarily. I got interested in struggles and protests, and why things were going wrong in the world, and and then discovered that, well, the people who were doing the kind of protests I like were all communists, and they were the most sort of disciplined people. They were not yelling insults at anybody. They really seemed disciplined, and that appealed to me. I mean, one part of me wanted to just go and fight the police, which I did at some point and paid a little price for it. But that's just stupid, to go and just get into a fight. It's much more important to work to build the confidence of working class and peasants, large numbers of people, to get involved. If you go and have a fight with a cop, you don't give people confidence to try to change the world. And I learned that pretty young. Like most people, the first Marx book I read was the Communist Manifesto, which truly, if people haven't read it, it's a prose poem. It's a beautiful text, and I was actually surprised how
one can read it in one go. It's so short.
Yeah, especially the first part, actually, before you get to the sections on, because there's stuff at the end, on the literature of the socialists and all that. Just the first part is elegant and beautiful, and you're right, you can read it in a sitting, yeah, and it's poetry, and I could understand everything. Like that was the surprise to me, because people said, Marx is very hard, and I thought really because in this text he says things like under pain of compulsion, I'm talking about the old translation, under pain of compulsion, you got to adopt the capitalist mode of production. If you don't, they attack you, or sometimes they subordinate your old forms of labor, slavery and so on, in order for your products to enter the capitalist economy, and he writes about that, and he talks about wars and how wars are used to get resource. It all just made sense to me. I was like, wow, this describes the world. Like nothing else I'd read described my reality in, let's say, 1986 as vividly as a text written in 1848. It's bizarre, I hadn't read anything as vivid. And I loved at that age, and even now, I loved reading poetry. I loved listening to songs with great lyrics, I love music, but I love songs with really good lyrics. I love poetry. I
Your
adore poetry.
your most of your articles at the Tricontinental ends with a poem.
I just adore the way a poet can condense emotion, In a line, they condense emotion. And Marx does that. Even the first line of the manifesto, yeah? A specter is haunting Europe. It's such a beautiful line. And so I got into Marx through the Communist Manifesto. And then, like most people, I read bits and pieces here. I bought in 1981, I bought 3 volumes of Capital, but, I didn't read it till much later. I bought it because at Progress Publishers, they used to set up the table in my school, and I bought Tolstoy. They were like, 1 rupee a book, big giant book, or 50 paisa. You could pay 2 rupees and get 3 the volumes. It was so cheap. Yeah, the Soviets were giving away books, and I bought lots of books. I had lots of these Soviet books, and I would read them and give them to my friends because they were cheap. Turgenev, Tolstoy, the old 19th century classics, Chekhov. I read all of them because it's cheap. Yeah, my school library had them, but whatever, doesn't matter. Marxism made sense to me, and then when I started reading Kwame Nkrumah, I got a little of that. When I started, Ho Chi Minh was always, just as an idea, was like a hero of mine. I didn't read anything, didn't know anything about him, but he was a heroic figure, Ho Chi Minh defeated the Americans. And so but when I started reading him, I was just captured by his writing because, I was captured by what he said about communists. What should a communist be like? And in fact, this is a lesson for people to live as humans, not just as communists. He talks about something called emulation, that as you grow up as a person, you should emulate people that you admire. You should try to be like them. In fact, this is a very old philosophical idea, that the way you become a moral person isn't to be an individual and to seek a better way to be yourself. The best, how they say you should be the best version of yourself. You don't know, you need role models. And that's exactly what he was talking about, emulation. And I found people to emulate, and I found that a very enriching way to grow up, And so Marxism for me was always a total science of the world, including how to be a person. It wasn't just how to analyze, And you read Lenin, how to be disciplined. And for Lenin, to be disciplined isn't to be obedient. It is to have a sharp mind, to sharpen your thinking about the world, to work to build collectively a worldview. That's what it means to be in a party. You build a worldview collectively, you see the world together, even if you have differences. By and large, you see all of this appealed to me. I didn't want to be an individual, I wanted to be in groups. I wanted to build things with people. I wanted to, as they say, rescue the collective life, which had been eroding. And so for me, that's Marxism. It's all of that. It's not just, the extraction of surplus value, which I think is like a finding for Marx that's extraordinary. Yeah, but it's all of this. It's Lenin, it's Ho Chi Minh, it's Walter Rodney. Go on and on. It's like a world of movements of the PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau. the people fighting in Mozambique and Angola against the Portuguese. It's all of that. These people provided a kind of Marxism that excited me. And I must say, towering above all this was two thinkers who I really emulated and grew from. One was Mao Zedong. I really thought that he was an extraordinary builder in such a poor country, to have defeated so much, to have built the confidence of the people. And even as a young person, I admired the Chinese Revolution. I never was taken by Naxalism or armed struggle in India. I always thought that was a little crazy. It's not going to, India, the state is too strong for that kind of thing. But Mao appealed to me, yeah, and the other was Fidel Castro. I just found, I was gripped, and I was so lucky to meet him several times. I was gripped by his personality and how he thought also of Marxism, not just as a science of understanding society, but a way of living in the world, how to be a person, and he, I think, fashioned himself as somebody to emulate. And in a whole world, I mean, we all emulated him. We all wanted to be like Fidel. If you gave me a choice, would you rather be like Che Guevara or Fidel? I would say it's an unfair choice, but I emulated Fidel. I wanted to build something. It's really hard to build socialism, really, really hard. And I admire people like, Lenin, Mao, Fidel, these people who were given the responsibility,
Che,
by struggle to build things. It's incredible.
sorry, I can't resist asking this. This choice between Che and Fidel also brought to my mind the choice between Trotsky and Stalin. I know that would be somewhat different given Trotsky. Stalin is so much mired in history, so much it's much more loaded than Che and Fidel.
Actually, not for me. It's not loaded for me, and I'll tell you why. I mean, I think within left movements, there are often disputes, and you can look at this doctrinally and so on. But I think there's something more than that here. Leon Trotsky came from an extremely fortunate background. He was well read as a child. He came from an upper middle class family. He was very bright. He wrote beautifully. Yeah, he was a very sincere and good communist. Stalin's mother was a domestic worker. He didn't have the intellectual advantages of Trotsky. He was an extraordinarily good organizer. I mean, because he came from the very poor end of the working class, he could speak to the working class. He built the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, with his working class hands. That group of Bolsheviks were people who came from the lower end of the working class. And I think there's a very unfortunate comparison made between Stalin and Trotsky when you look at their writings. One is a highly erudite person who comes from an upper middle class family, can quote from, this source and that source. The other comes with a great deal of anger at the bourgeoisie, anger at the elite, and hates the elite. He has what I would call genuine hatred. That's what Stalin had. Genuine hatred of the nobility. I mean, he knew how badly his mother had been treated. If you read, biographies of him, that's an impact on somebody like that. So for me, if you say Stalin or Trotsky, I say, well, let's look at their backgrounds and let's see, what Stalin was able to do from his background. I mean, okay, there's all kinds of horrible things you can list. At the end of the day, Stalin disagreed with Bukharin. Bukharin said, look, this is the path to development for us. And Bukharin was right. But Bukharin's path, Stalin saw, would take decades. Yeah, it was a very good way to industrialize. Bukharin's plan was excellent. This is how we're going to deal with the peasantry, blah, 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 do some collectivization, but it was going to take decades. Stalin said, we don't have decades. They're going to invade us. They're going to destroy us. And he made a choice there. We have to go for industrialization. It has a lot of grief attached to Stalin's economic policy, because that meant super rack-rented situation for the peasantry, yeah? But they industrialized. And because of that, and because of the sacrifice of 25 million Soviet citizens, fascism was destroyed in Europe. Britain would be speaking German and they would be saluting statues of Adolf Hitler without Stalin's choice. Yeah, quite frankly, And so, in my opinion, if you look at it from that point of view, yeah, in my opinion, from that point of view, it is very, very clear to me. Okay, to me, it's very clear that you can't make a choice like Stalin versus Trotsky and say, let's choose between this guy's writings and this guy's gulags. If you make it, because that's what happens with Stalin versus Trotsky. It's that, oh, Trotsky is great to read. His texts are so interesting and they're so filled with brilliant insights, yeah, and in quotes from literature and so on. And this guy is the gulag. He sent people to death. If you have that choice, well, it's an obvious choice, yeah. But then if you look at the big picture, it's a much more difficult choice. And I'm not saying I'm willing to make a choice, but I think in my description, I really understand, and I think people don't understand what it meant to be from that level of the working class. I mean, if you look at the totality of the Bolsheviks, most of them come from the working class and the lower end of the working class, many of them. Cecilia Bobrovskaya, whose memoir we published from Leftwards, incredible book, was Lenin's courier. She used to go from the Tsarist Empire to see Lenin in Geneva, wherever he was, to give him books and, smuggle newspapers and give him, download to him what was happening in the party in Russia. They would walk for hours, she writes in her memoir. She grew up in a household, mother was working, father was a rabbi, or, he was a Talmudic scholar, never did a lick of work in the day. She grew up in a household with abject poverty. That's the Bolshevik I admire, not people like myself, who come from families, who have libraries, who can quote poetry at will. I don't admire somebody like me. I admire somebody like Cecilia Bobrovskaya, who comes from real abject poverty, becomes a Bolshevik, studies, reads. After the Russian Revolution, Lenin is sitting in his office, yeah, and he asks people, "Where's Bobrovskaya? We've won. Now where is she?" Well, finds out she's living in in squalor, yeah, really bad condition, and she's no position and she's in a bad way. So Lenin says, "No, Bobrovskaya must live in Moscow near us," and he does something incredible. He opens a building called the Society of Old Bolsheviks. Okay. And he sets up people like Bobrovskaya to live in there. They have a common kitchen and so on, a library. And he tells them, you have a task. You guys now, all of you are old. You are going to write your own memoirs in little booklets. And you're going to write the history of our party, what all you did. And that literature, I have a lot of those. The Soviets translated them as well. Little pamphlets, biographies of different Bolsheviks and those who died. They remembered and wrote things about those who died. That is one of the most beautiful parts of the October Revolution, that all these old communists who had built the revolution then lived together, yeah, in this sort of commune, and they were tasked with producing their histories. And if you read those, you'll cry. Because most of these Bolsheviks come from like artisanal families, factory workers, and the low end of the working class, meaning they were, loaders, people who walked around carrying big loads because then they could smuggle newspapers. Yeah, I admire them. Stalin comes from there. Let's not forget that. That's all.
Yeah, I think my comment was in the context of Fidel building a state. I mean, there is a difference between building a revolution and building a state. And Trotsky, as much as Stalin as well, and both Fidel and Che, they built the revolution, but two of them built the state, and it's a different art, right? And it has a much, I mean, let me not say much bigger contribution, but it has a very different contribution, and one can't overlook that. But yeah, I remember 10 years ago, I read the 10 days that shook the world, and it made me cry. I mean, not just because Leon Trotsky was said by one of the guards that if you are Leon Trotsky, then you shouldn't forget your ID or you wouldn't be allowed to enter the Smolny Institute, but also how they martyred their revolutionary soldiers for the first time under the red flag of peasants and workers' unity instead of the Eastern Orthodox flag. And, those were moving descriptions by John Reed. You were correct, Vijay, that we could go on this for the whole day, but we don't have the time. But thank you so much for this time, and this was a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
It's always good to chat with you. Okay, it's fun. Thanks a lot.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.